Another family pattern is kind of the opposite, disengagement. And in this pattern, you have family members who aren't emotionally close to each other. Sometimes they live far apart. They have few contacts. And so what happens is when you have a TBI, it's very hard to mobilize this family. They don't really feel responsible for each other. Sometimes the family becomes detached because of many years of living with a brain-injured person, because it's difficult, and the only way to sort of handle some of the difficulties are to move away. I had an interesting client where the person had 6 children living in different states, and also 2 children living in the same city as she did. And after an aneurysm, the person who coordinated all of Mom's care was the person who lived in North Carolina. And the person who lived in the same state, which was 1,000 miles away, would see Mom maybe twice a year. I can't deal with it, I can't handle it. That's the excuse. So a kind of disengaged family. Well, you can see how hurtful that might be. Another pattern is called triangulation. And the idea here is that, I'm not going to be able to reach up there, so I'll do it with this. We might have a husband and wife here, and then let's say the adult child with brain injury here. And triangulation refers to when relationships become close, but not in the most healthy way, to avoid dealing with the third point of the, to avoid dealing with problems they themselves have, marital problems that were going on. But now they can join together and they can deal with the family member, the brain-injured person. And we see this in lots of illnesses, not just brain injury. The diabetic child becomes the absolute focus of the family. And one of the problems here is that if the person no longer needs help, the young adult child has a good recovery after several years, wants to move out, they serve as a way of keeping the husband and wife together. And so there may be a lot of complaints on the parents' part, or over-concern on the parents' part. They're not letting that young adult person sort of grow up and be. Sometimes you often have a triangle that doesn't really exist, and that's the perfect person that your brain-injured relative was before injury. And so there's this idealization that you focus on. In fact, it's rarely true. So lots of triangles can happen. There could be a triangle between 2 siblings who focus on the brain-injured person. There could be the triangle between husband and wife at that overlap. Oops. Within all of these patterns, there may be different patterns of communication. And so people with TBI, as we mentioned before, may become more sensitive to tone and less to content. So I put a sort of referee. A lot of times people will tell me that they're the member of the family who feels like they're the referee between the brain-injured person and other people in the family. I've had a lot of clients who will tell me that their spouses or their parents scream at them, yell at them. And when you listen to it, it's not screaming and yelling. It might be something that's a little bit negative. They become very sensitive to tone, particularly with these right-sided injuries. So they're not sensitive to nonverbal communication. Some people might be less sensitive to idiomatic expressions, expressions that are metaphors or with double meaning. My favorite one, a young woman client I had a right-sided brain injury, and she would take things literally. So one day I said to her, well, I don't want to hang you up. I know you have another appointment, so call me and we'll set up an appointment for next week. She looked at me totally straight-faced and said, hang me up? If I was going to commit suicide, I don't think I would hang myself. Because she took it literally. And so you'll see this. Well, if that happens, you can see how people can misunderstand and how there can be miscommunication. You said X. Well, I didn't mean that, as well. So they may be less sensitive in that way. There's another kind of communication that you may have heard of called double bind communication. Most people don't only half of this. The double bind is kind of the idea that I was getting at earlier, that you say one thing, but your nonverbal behavior creates another impression. So in the double bind, you have one verbal message, another message that's contradictory, but that's not the double bind, really. The double bind is when somebody points it out and you say, oh no, don't be so sensitive, darling. I was only joking. You take it back, and yet the person has really heard that double message. So this is, again, an example. The wife says, I want you to be independent to the brain-injured husband. And he says, I built a shelf the other day. And she rolls her eyes and chuckles because from her standpoint, the shelf never really got built. And he says, you really don't support me, you see? Look at you. And she says, no, I was only joking. Of course I want to support you. He's picked up on something there. It's not completely insensitive. And so this kind of communication is really hard to deal with because you have to start listening and hearing yourself and taking a look at this spatial map that you're putting out in the form of your own face when you're talking to other people as you're going to change communication skills. A lot of times there's guilt inducement. And maybe some of you have felt that in your own families when there's been illness. You think you had it so tough? Why are you complaining? Daddy was in the hospital for 6 months with his brain injury. And many children of people with brain injury will say that none of their negative experiences are ever made legitimate by their families because nothing could be equal to the terrible thing that dad or mom went through. And so they learn to tamp down any kind of negative experience. And they resent it. Then, of course, it can happen in the other way. You're always guilt-inducing your children for the help that you want. In the case of the woman that I told you about with the 6 kids who would call North Carolina, I mean, she wanted help often from the people who weren't going to give it. And the person who gave it to her, there was a lot of criticism. Marie was another very critical person. It took her a long time to realize that she almost never said anything positive without really putting in a niggling little criticism in there. Doesn't make people want to work with you or make your family members want to be around you. So those are some examples of looking at family patterns that we could apply to any family, but I think are shown writ large when we're dealing with brain injury. Any questions here? Sometimes interesting to look at your own families and see if there might be elements of what we're talking about in your interaction patterns. Are there elements of alliances, of these triangulations, whether you have an injured person in your family or not? Some of the other theories that have been used and are often used in therapy come from what are called behavioral or learning theory, learning traditions. And in learning theory, the idea is that what we do after a behavior occurs, a reinforcement, increases or decreases behavior. And that we can inadvertently, accidentally reinforce behaviors we really don't want to reinforce without realizing what we're doing. So, positive reinforcement, this is a term that people misunderstand. They think it means that you praise somebody and that you're rewarding them. And I always think of reward. A reward is something you get for doing one nice thing that you didn't have to do. Reinforcement happens all the time. It is a consequence to our behaviors. So positive reinforcement means that you increase a behavior. It's not good or bad, you're just increasing it. It's a positive, like in a number line. And so one of the things that seems to happen often with people with illness, as well as with TBI, is that they're often only paid attention to when they have symptoms, when they have complaints. If you attend to people only when they have complaints, the complaints are going to go up. And we see this in nursing homes. If you actually spend time talking with an older person in a nursing home, not about their health, You don't just come running when they have a problem. You spend time with them. What you find is that physical complaints actually go down. You weren't reinforcing or, in a sense, rewarding the behavior of complaining. You were doing something else. So we will often see that a lot of times people are only attended to when things go wrong, and we kind of forget when things are going right. Now here's another concept, negative reinforcement. And in negative reinforcement, behavior still goes up. It's negative because it's a number line. It's subtraction. We remove something, and yet that something increases behavior. I once worked with a brain-injured patient, taught him these ideas, and he came up with a wonderfully good example of negative reinforcement. So if a brain-injured person can come up with it, you can come up with all sorts of things. And his example was his niece was in her car seat, and she would yell and yell and yell because she didn't want to be in the car seat, and the family members would undo the strap and let her be alone in the back seat at the age of 3. The removal of nagging, the removal of the car seat, I've got to do this right. I'm sorry, this is a mess. It's too late at night. We have 2 different behaviors that are going on here. We have an increase in screaming on the part of the child, positive reinforcement. Because when you remove her from the car seat, she's learned an interesting lesson. All I have to do is scream, and I'll get out of the car seat. The parents have been negatively reinforced. The removal of the obnoxious nagging behavior on the part of the child means they're going to do what's going to remove the screaming, nagging behavior. Let her out of the car seat. So sometimes what happens is we'll find that we're misusing this kind of reinforcement. Husband cooks for months after the wife's brain injury. She was always the cook. That was her role, but she never liked it. And so now she never volunteers, even though she's actually perfectly capable of cooking. And then the complaint is she never helps out. She never does anything. But what does he do? He cooks. Nagging, again, spouse gives into nagging to stave off a temper tantrum. So you are getting rid of something obnoxious, but you're also increasing the likelihood that the nagging and the temper tantrum will happen. Behavioral terms, punishment means that we decrease behavior. It does not mean that we hurt people. It's not physical punishment. It's just a term for decreasing behavior. And so a lot of times we do things inadvertently that decrease behavior that we don't mean to. This was something that happens a lot to my clients. The wife criticizes the husband with TBI because he didn't do a chore right, instead of acknowledging that he actually tried to do it. And so his response is, why even bother? And so she says, but I said, okay, you did it, but, and it's the but that then decreases the behavior. So he's not going to try again, and so forth. It's hard in our society to positively reinforce people or to give praise and not sound condescending. It's one thing to say, tell people they did a good job, but I don't know, in my 50s, I don't want people to say, good job, like the nurses in the hospital. So part of what I'm saying here is you have to be more careful about doing that, but it has to be in a manner that befits the age and experience of the person. A lot of times in psychotherapy and rehabilitation therapy, we create all sorts of check charts and activity sheets and check-offs where we try to help people see that they've really accomplished something, that they've done something in small steps. They could see it. If you have memory loss, you may not realize that you actually were able to accomplish something, but if you can look at a notebook or you can look at a large chart on your refrigerator, you can see that indeed you did it. So those are important. Well, Marie finally decided on a solution to the critical problems that she had, or the criticizing problems, and she posted Post-it notes all over her house. And they said, compliment, don't criticize. Now, there was a little bit of an issue with this because Marie felt that she needed a clean house and she really didn't want to post those notes. But finally, people convinced her, Mom, it's okay. We would rather have you think about this. Let's not worry about whether the Post-it note looks good. So there are lots of inventive things that you can do to try to increase this kind of reinforcement. Okay. Any questions here? What are some solutions? Because I've talked about patterns and I've talked about problems. The solutions to trying to create a more harmonious family life, egalitarian family life, is going to depend on different aspects of stage of recovery and different abilities that the person has, of course. Sadly, there are some people who will always have short-term memory loss. There are some people who may never really regain the use of speech. But brain injury is on a continuum. And so there are people who even years later often find that there are small steps and small aspects of recovery. In terms of cognitive rehabilitation, which was not my topic today, but I will say that lists and boards and structures and reminder notes and creating anything that replaces your own memory is really important. I've had clients who had good cognition. They could really organize and think well, but they had some memory problems. Having a BlackBerry or a PDA was an absolute lifesaver for them. You're not going to do it in your own mind, but having those kinds of tasks, they could learn those kinds of tasks, different ways of doing it. I think for family members, it is important that family members do need some kind of respite. Now, we recognize this in the case of people with Alzheimer's disease. There are even agencies that will take care of your loved one for a while. But in brain injury, you're not that debilitated. And so you don't have these organizations where somebody will come in. But I do think that if you have a larger family or you have friends, figuring out a way to have some respite. And that respite might not be a full day. It might be 4 hours on a Thursday every week where you have time to yourself. Traditional methods of stress management seem to work, as well as relaxation exercises and so forth. Sometimes counseling or psychotherapy for the family members alone is very helpful. Again, you're not necessarily dealing with traditional problems that you would in counseling. You're dealing with how to interact. Sometimes counseling for the person with TBI can work, not always. Often it's really the family that will benefit because the person with TBI is not going to be able to try out these new things. Recently, there have been some planned family interventions, and Jeff Kreutzer at the Medical College of Virginia just published a paper this year on a program with 8 or 9 sessions for families, and each day there's a particular kind of topic, and they do some communication training, some changing of reinforcement. They talk about family dynamics, etc., and it seems to have alleviated distress. It's still in pilot testing phases. Some health insurance companies will allow for family therapy or counseling. Not all will. They don't consider brain injury a disorder that's in need of this. Activities. Lots of things go wrong in families, and you need to find something that is positive that you can agree to try to do, even though it might be awkward. A date night, a family night where everybody is doing something with the brain injured person. Maybe they wouldn't enjoy it at first, but maybe it's worth doing. Watching a favorite old movie that you've seen before, the person remembers, and discussing it. And really trying to make an effort to do those kinds of things so that you can have interaction again are important. I think brain injury support groups for family members are very important. And this morning on the radio, I said that unfortunately there was not a brain injury support group in Stevens Point, but I understand that there's going to be one. And that's you. It's okay. No problem. And in 2 seconds, we'll talk about that. But I think that some of the brain injury support groups that I've run, it helps to have family members by themselves, not always with the person, and then bring them back together again. Sometimes it helps to have support groups with just the person who has brain injury together. Those are really helpful, but you have to be ready. You have to kind of say, okay, I've been feeling uncomfortable enough now, and maybe I need to do something about it. This is not going to work because it turns out that the wireless is not working, but I can email this to you. This www research channel is from the University of Washington, and this is a program called Living with Brain Injury. It's 29 minutes, made very recently, and it has a whole section in which spouses discuss what it was like for them, as well as focus on 4 brain-injured people. And one of the things that you hear over and over again is the importance of support groups for spouses. And one of the women says something like, I never thought I would do anything like that, and finally I was ready, and it was very, very useful. And support groups are pretty much free. Sometimes they're run by members themselves, sometimes they do have professional facilitators. But that can be useful. You can get ideas from other people, as well as sort of tell your story and realize that you're not alone. And they're also useful for brain-injured people, so that you learn that you're not alone, and you also see the successes and changes that people can have as individuals. So with that, can we pass this